The first thing I remember about Officer James was his laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh you heard every day, the half-hearted chuckle or forced humor that most of us carried around like a worn-out badge. No, his laugh was genuine, booming, and full of life, echoing through the narrow streets of our little neighborhood like a warm summer breeze. You could hear it from blocks away, and no matter what kind of day you were having, it somehow made you feel like things weren't so bad after all. James was more than just a cop in our community. He was our protector, our friend, and in many ways, the glue that held this place together. It didn't matter who you were, where you came from, or what kind of trouble you got into. James treated everyone with the same unwavering respect and kindness. He was the kind of man who could spot a kid on the wrong path, and instead of throwing them in the back of a patrol car, he'd offer them a ride to the community center, where he'd sit down and talk to them like they were one of his own. It wasn't long after I moved into the neighborhood that I got to know James. My wife and I had just settled into our small old house, a fixer-upper, but it had potential, or so I convinced her. We were young, looking to start a family, and I was trying to get used to the idea of being a responsible adult. One evening, as I was trying to figure out why the lawnmower wouldn't start, a deep voice called out from across the street. "You look like you're about to go to war with that thing." The voice laughed. I turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man leaning against a police cruiser, his arms crossed over his chest and a wide grin on his face. He had on his uniform, crisp and neatly pressed, like he took pride in every aspect of his job, but there was an ease in the way he carried himself. A kind of effortless confidence that made him seem less like a figure of authority and more like an old friend. "You need some help?" he asked, still grinning. "Yeah," I admitted, feeling slightly embarrassed. "I can't seem to get this thing to start." He walked over, extending his hand. "I'm James, by the way, Officer James, but you can just call me James." "Nice to meet you, James," I replied, shaking his hand. "I'm Dan." James took a quick look at the lawnmower, fiddled with a few things, and within minutes, the engine roared to life. I remember feeling a mix of gratitude and humiliation, but James didn't make a big deal out of it. He just patted me on the back and said, "Sometimes all you need is a fresh set of eyes, Dan." That's how it started, my friendship with James. It didn't take long for me to realize that he was more than just a friendly neighbor. He was the kind of person who genuinely cared about the people around him. He wasn't just doing his job as a cop, he saw his role as something more, something deeper. He saw it as his responsibility to protect, guide, and uplift everyone he could. Over time, I watched James become a cornerstone of our community. He wasn't just the guy in blue who showed up when things went south. He was at every neighborhood event, every school fair, every charity drive. He was the guy who organized food drives during the holidays and volunteered to coach the kids' basketball team when no one else would step up. He was the first one to show up when someone's house got broken into and the last one to leave after making sure everyone was okay. There was a small park at the end of our street where the neighborhood kids would gather after school. It wasn't much, just a couple of swings, a rusty slide, and a basketball hoop with a net that had seen better days. But to the kids, it was their haven, their little world away from the worries of life. James made it a point to stop by every now and then, not to patrol or keep an eye on things, but to play ball with the kids and talk to them like they were his friends. One day I saw him sitting on a bench, chatting with a group of teenagers who looked like they'd been up to no good. They were the kind of kids most people would cross the street to avoid, tough, rough around the edges, and carrying more baggage than they knew how to handle. But James didn't see them that way. He saw them as kids who needed someone to believe in them. "Why are you wasting your time with those punks?" One of the neighbors, old Mrs. Thompson, asked him once, her voice full of disdain. James just smiled at her and said, "They're not punks, Mrs. Thompson. They're just kids trying to figure things out." That was James, always looking for the good in people, even when others couldn't see it. He wasn't naive, and he wasn't blind to the realities of his job. He knew better than anyone that not everyone could be saved, and not every story had a happy ending. But that didn't stop him from trying. I think that's why people loved him so much. It wasn't just that he was good at his job, though he was better than anyone I'd ever seen. It was that he genuinely cared about making a difference. He didn't just want to protect us. He wanted to lift us up, to help us become better versions of ourselves. The community saw him as a protector, a guardian, and a friend. To me, he was all of those things, but he was also something more. He was a reminder that goodness still existed in the world, even when it felt like it didn't. He was proof that one person could make a difference, not just with a badge and a gun, but with kindness, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the goodness of people. And that's why, when the unthinkable happened, it felt like the world had lost a piece of its heart. But that's a story for another day. For now, I want you to know who James was, why he meant so much to us, and why his death shook us to our core. He wasn't just a good cop, he was a good man. And in this world, those are harder to come by than you might think. When you become friends with someone like James, it's hard not to look up to them. He wasn't just a good cop, he was a good friend, the kind of person who would drop everything at a moment's notice if you needed him. And I did, often enough. There were late nights when my daughter Lily had a fever that wouldn't break, or days when the stress of juggling work and family life felt like too much to bear. Somehow, James always seemed to show up at the right time, a calming presence when everything else felt like it was falling apart. It wasn't just me, though. James had a way of making everyone in the neighborhood feel like they mattered. He never saw his job as just enforcing the law. He saw it as protecting a community he loved. That's why he'd go out of his way to know every name and face, to stop and chat with Mrs. Gonzalez about her vegetable garden, or give old Mr. Fletcher a hand with his groceries. He didn't just protect us, he cared about us. James wasn't married. He'd had a fiancée once, years before I met him, but it hadn't worked out. He never talked much about it, but there were moments, late at night when we were sitting on the porch with a couple of beers, that he'd let his guard down a bit. He'd mention her in passing, his voice wistful and tinged with sadness, but he never dwelled on it. I think in his heart, he'd accepted that some things just weren't meant to be. Guess it wasn't in the cards for me, he'd say with a rueful chuckle, taking a long sip from his beer. But hey, I've got all of you, right? And he did. The people in the neighborhood were his family, in every way that mattered. He took pride in watching the kids grow up, always making sure they stayed out of trouble and on the right path. He'd been there for graduations, birthdays, and even a couple of weddings, grinning from ear to ear like a proud father. It was no different with me and my family. James and I had become more than neighbors. We were friends, the kind who didn't need to say much to understand each other. He'd stop by for dinner sometimes, and my wife, Claire, would always set an extra place at the table, knowing he'd show up eventually. He loved Claire's cooking, and she loved hearing his stories, both the funny ones and the ones that left you feeling like you'd glimpsed something darker beneath the surface. One evening after dinner, we were sitting on the porch while Lily played in the yard, her laughter echoing in the cool night air. James was watching her with a soft smile, the way he always did when he saw kids being kids. It was a look that spoke of both joy and longing, and I think he saw in them what he couldn't have himself, a chance to make things better for the next generation. "She's getting big," he said, his voice quiet. "Yeah," I replied, glancing over at my daughter as she twirled around in the grass. "She's growing up too fast." James nodded, his eyes distant for a moment. Then he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You ever wonder if what we do is enough?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say. It wasn't the first time James had expressed doubts about his work, but it was the first time he'd said it so openly. He wasn't the type to complain or dwell on the hardships. He carried the weight of his job with a quiet grace, never letting it show unless he trusted you enough to see it. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, we do what we can, right? We try to protect people, to keep them safe. But there are days when it feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. There's always more crime, more pain, more people getting hurt." I could hear the frustration in his voice, the weariness of a man who had seen too much. It wasn't just about the job. It was about the world, about the people he couldn't save and the lives he couldn't fix. James cared so deeply, and that caring came with a heavy price. "But you do help people," I said softly. "You've made a difference, James. You've made this place better." He smiled, but it was a sad, tired smile. "Maybe," he replied. "But sometimes it feels like a drop in the ocean, you know?" I didn't have an answer for that. What could I say to a man who had given so much of himself to a world that seemed determined to test his resolve? All I could do was sit there, listening to the sound of the crickets and the distant hum of passing cars, and be there for him in whatever way I could. That night, as we sat in silence, I realized just how much James meant to me. Not just as a friend, but as a symbol of everything that was still good in the world. He wasn't perfect, and he knew that better than anyone. But he never stopped trying, and that was more than most people could say. Over the years, James and I shared more moments like that. Quiet conversations where the weight of the world seemed to press down on him, and all I could do was offer a listening ear. I learned a lot about him during those talks, about his fears, his regrets, and his unwavering sense of duty. He didn't just see himself as a cop. He saw himself as a protector, a guide, and sometimes even a father figure to the kids who needed one. There was one boy in particular who stood out: Tyler. Tyler was a troubled kid, the kind who always seemed to be teetering on the edge of making a bad decision. His father was long gone, and his mother was doing her best to hold things together. But it wasn't easy. Tyler was angry at the world, and he didn't know how to channel that anger into something positive. James saw something in Tyler that most people didn't. A glimmer of hope, a spark that hadn't been snuffed out by the hardships he faced. He made it his mission to reach out to the boy, to show him that there was more to life than anger and resentment. I remember one day, seeing James and Tyler sitting on the front steps of Tyler's house, deep in conversation. James wasn't lecturing or scolding him. He was just talking to him, like an older brother or a mentor. He listened to Tyler's frustrations, his fears, and his dreams, and he offered advice without judgment. "You've got a choice, Tyler," James said, his voice calm and steady. "You can let the world beat you down, or you can stand up and fight for something better. But you've got to believe that you're worth fighting for." Those words stuck with me long after that conversation was over. It wasn't just about Tyler. It was about all of us. James had a way of making you feel like you were worth something, even when you didn't believe it yourself. He saw the good in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. Over time, Tyler started to change. He still had his moments of anger and rebellion, but there was a shift in him, a quiet determination to prove that he was more than his circumstances. He started coming to the community center more often, playing basketball with the other kids, and even volunteering to help out with events. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start, and it was all because of James. I think that's what made James so special. His ability to see the potential in people, to believe in them even when they didn't believe in themselves. He wasn't just a good cop. He was a good person, the kind of person who made the world a little bit brighter just by being in it. But there were shadows, too. As much as James loved his job, it wasn't without its challenges. He dealt with things that most of us couldn't even imagine: violence, betrayal, and the kind of pain that leaves scars you can't see. And through it all, he never let it break him, never let it harden his heart. There were nights when he'd come by after a particularly tough shift, his shoulders slumped and his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He wouldn't say much, just sit there on the porch, staring out at the dark street, lost in thought. I knew better than to press him for details. Some things were better left unsaid. But even in those moments, when the weight of the world seemed to bear down on him, James never lost his sense of purpose. He knew that what he did mattered, even if it didn't always feel that way. He knew that he was making a difference, one person at a time, one moment at a time. It wasn't easy, being friends with someone like James. He carried so much on his shoulders, and there were times when I felt helpless, unsure of how to support him. But he never let me see that side of him for too long. He'd always bounce back, with that same booming laugh and that same wide grin, ready to take on whatever the world threw at him. And that's the thing about James. He wasn't just a friend, or a neighbor, or a cop. He was a light in a dark world, a reminder that goodness still existed, even in the midst of chaos. I think that's why losing him was so hard, because he wasn't just a good cop. He was the best of us. There's a saying that heroes are made by the paths they choose, not the powers they possess. But what people don't often tell you is that choosing the right path comes with a cost. And for James, that cost was heavy. He carried it quietly, never wanting to burden others with the weight of his choices. James had a way of making everything seem easy. Whether he was talking to a troubled kid on the street or diffusing a tense situation between feuding neighbors, he always seemed to know the right thing to say, the right way to make people feel seen and understood. But I knew that being a good cop wasn't just about saying the right words or having the right intentions. It was about making sacrifices, big and small, every single day. In those moments, when the laughter faded and the conversations turned serious, James would talk about the sacrifices he made for his job. He never complained or regretted his choices, but there was an unspoken heaviness in his voice whenever he mentioned the people he couldn't save, the lives he couldn't mend. One evening, we were sitting on my porch, sipping on cold beers as the sun dipped below the horizon. It had been a long day, one of those stifling summer days that seemed to drag on forever, and we were both feeling the weight of it. "How was your shift?" I asked, knowing that it had been a rough week for him. There had been a string of break-ins in the neighborhood, and tensions were running high. People were scared, frustrated, and quick to point fingers, and it seemed like everyone was looking to James for answers. He sighed, taking a long sip of his beer before answering. "You know, the usual," he replied, his voice tired. "Trying to keep the peace, trying to keep people from losing their heads." "Any luck?" I asked, half joking. James chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "Some days are better than others," he said, "but there's always something, some new problem, some new crisis. Sometimes it feels like I'm just putting out fires, one after another." I could hear the weariness in his voice, and I knew there was more to it than he was letting on. James wasn't the type to dwell on the negative, but he wasn't immune to it either. He'd seen things that most of us couldn't even imagine, things that left scars on the soul. "Must be hard," I said, not knowing what else to say. It felt like such a small thing to acknowledge, but sometimes that was all you could do. "Yeah," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is." I waited, sensing that there was more he wanted to say. And after a moment, he took a deep breath and continued. "There was this kid today," he said, staring down at his beer. "Barely 16, but already so angry at the world. Got caught up with the wrong crowd, and now he's looking at time in juvie. His mom was there, begging me to help, and all I could do was tell her that there was nothing I could do. The system's the system, and sometimes it feels like it's built to keep people down." For a while, we sat in silence, the darkness wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. James stared out at the street, lost in thought, and I could tell that whatever was weighing on him wasn't going to be easy to talk about. "There was an incident today," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Domestic disturbance call. A couple arguing, things got heated. The guy had a gun." I felt my stomach drop. "Did anyone get hurt?" I asked, fearing the worst. James shook his head. "No, I managed to talk him down," he said. "But it was close, too close. One wrong move and it could have gone south real quick." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Thank God for that," I said, my voice shaky. "Yeah," James replied, but there was no relief in his voice. "But you know what's messed up? Even after all that, all I could think about was how many more times I'm going to have to face situations like that. How many more times I'm going to have to put myself in harm's way, knowing that it could all go wrong in an instant." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain I hadn't seen before. "What if one day it does go wrong?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if I can't save someone? What if I don't make it home?" It was a question I didn't have an answer to. I wanted to tell him that everything would be fine, that he was too good at what he did for anything to go wrong. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. James had chosen a path that was fraught with danger and uncertainty, and there were no guarantees. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know that you're doing everything you can, and that's all anyone can ask of you." James didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring out at the street, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him like a heavy burden. "I'm just so tired, Dan," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Tired of feeling like I'm fighting a losing battle." I didn't know what to say. There were no words that could ease the pain he was feeling, no reassurances that could make everything okay. All I could do was be there for him, to offer my support in whatever way I could. "Whatever happens, you're not alone," I said softly. "You've got people who care about you, James. Don't forget that." He looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Thanks, Dan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That means more than you know." That night, as James left my house and disappeared into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He was still the same good cop, still the same friend and protector, but there was a heaviness in his heart that I couldn't ignore. It was as if the shadows of his sacrifices were finally catching up to him, and I didn't know how to help him carry that weight. In the weeks that followed, the tension in the neighborhood only seemed to grow. There were more break-ins, more calls for disturbances, more signs that something was brewing beneath the surface. And through it all, James kept doing what he did best, protecting, serving, and caring for the people around him, even when it felt like the world was falling apart. But I could see the toll it was taking on him. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and there were days when the wariness in his eyes seemed almost unbearable. He tried to hide it, tried to put on a brave face for everyone else's sake, but I knew him well enough to see through the facade. And as much as I wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that James would find a way to push through the darkness, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. It was a feeling that lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet voice whispering that something terrible was coming. But I didn't listen to that voice. I didn't want to believe that anything could happen to someone like James, someone who had given so much of himself to a world that didn't always deserve it. And in the end, that was my mistake. It was a Tuesday when everything started to spiral. Not that any of us realized it at the time. Tuesday had always felt like one of those inconspicuous days, a filler between the mundanity of Monday and the slow build-up to the weekend. But sometimes it's on those ordinary days that the worst things happen. The days when you let your guard down because you think nothing can touch you. James had been busier than usual over the past couple of weeks. The increase in disturbances and petty crimes around the neighborhood wasn't typical. This was a close-knit community, one where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors to look out for one another. But recently, a new tension had taken hold. Break-ins, muggings, and drug deals were becoming more frequent, and nobody seemed to know why or how it had all started. It wasn't long before rumors started spreading. People talked about a new gang trying to push its way into the neighborhood, or about outsiders coming in and stirring up trouble. Some blamed the kids hanging out at the park, while others pointed fingers at the new families who had recently moved in. But James refused to jump to conclusions. He was a believer in facts, not hearsay. So he spent long nights gathering information, patrolling the streets, and keeping a watchful eye on his community. "James, you're going to wear yourself out," I told him one evening as we stood on my porch. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the world. "Can't afford to take a break, Dan," he replied, his voice low and strained. "Not when there's trouble brewing." "You don't have to do this all on your own, you know," I said, hoping to convince him to take a step back, even just for a little while. "There are other cops." "Not like me," he interrupted, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left no room for argument. "I know these streets, I know these people, and I'm not going to let them down." There was a determination in his voice that I couldn't argue with, and I knew that trying to convince him to slow down would only be met with resistance. But I was worried, more worried than I'd ever been before. James had always been resilient, but even the strongest of us have our limits. As the days went on, James started mentioning a new name, Rodrigo. He was an outsider, someone who had recently moved into the neighborhood, but his reputation preceded him. People whispered that Rodrigo was dangerous, that he was trying to take over the local drug trade, and that he wasn't above using intimidation and violence to get what he wanted. James had his suspicions about Rodrigo, but he didn't have enough evidence to act on them. And while he was gathering information, Rodrigo's presence in the neighborhood continued to grow, like a dark cloud hanging over our once peaceful streets. I remember one night, James came over after his shift, looking more worn out than ever. He didn't say much, just sat on the porch with me, staring off into the darkness. There was a heaviness in the air, a tension that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. "You think this Rodrigo guy is behind all this trouble?" I asked, breaking the silence. James didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, his jaw clenched as he seemed to wrestle with his thoughts. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there's something off about him, Dan. He's got his fingers in a lot of pies, and none of them are good." I could see the frustration in his eyes. The frustration of knowing that there was something wrong, but not having the proof to do anything about it. James was a man who believed in doing things by the book, and he wasn't about to jump to conclusions without solid evidence. But that didn't mean the threat wasn't real. In the days that followed, things only seemed to get worse. The tension in the neighborhood continued to build, and James was more on edge than ever. He wasn't sleeping much, and when he did, it was fitful and restless. He spent every waking moment patrolling, gathering information, and trying to piece together the puzzle of what was happening in our community. It wasn't long before Rodrigo started making himself known. He was a tall, imposing man with a demeanor that radiated authority and danger. I remember the first time I saw him, standing on the corner with a couple of his associates, his eyes scanning the neighborhood like a predator surveying its prey. He was dressed sharply, his movements calculated and deliberate, and there was an air of menace about him that sent a chill down my spine. James didn't hide his distrust of Rodrigo, and it wasn't long before the two of them crossed paths. One evening, while James was on patrol, he found Rodrigo and his associates loitering near the park where the neighborhood kids often played. James approached them, his hand resting casually on his belt, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You boys wouldn't happen to be causing any trouble, would you?" Rodrigo turned to face him, a slow, almost lazy smile spreading across his face. He was confident, too confident, like he knew something James didn't. "Officer James," Rodrigo said, his voice smooth and unhurried. "Just enjoying the fresh air. Is that a crime?" James didn't rise to the bait. He just stared at Rodrigo, his eyes cold and unwavering. "No," he replied. "But hanging around this park, making people uncomfortable? That's a problem." Rodrigo's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm just a man trying to make a living," he said, his tone dripping with false sincerity. "I'm not here to cause trouble, officer." James didn't say anything, but the tension between them was palpable. It was clear that neither of them trusted the other, and I could see the gears turning in James's mind as he tried to figure out what Rodrigo's next move would be. In the days that followed, James kept a close eye on Rodrigo and his associates, determined to catch them in the act. But Rodrigo was smart. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to keep his dealings in the shadows where the law couldn't reach him. And as the pressure mounted, I could see the toll it was taking on James. One evening, he came over to my house, looking more exhausted than ever. He hadn't shaved in days, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "You okay?" I asked, my concern growing with each passing day. James shook his head, letting out a heavy sigh. "This guy Dan, he's dangerous. I can feel it." "What are you going to do?" I asked, feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. "I don't know," James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't let him keep doing this. I can't let him ruin this community." There was a determination in his voice that both reassured and terrified me. I knew that James wasn't going to back down, but I also knew that he was facing a threat unlike any he had faced before. Rodrigo wasn't just a petty criminal. He was calculating, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. As the tension in the neighborhood continued to build, I found myself feeling more and more uneasy. I trusted James. I knew he was capable of handling himself, but there was something about Rodrigo that made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering precariously, and that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. And then, one night, everything changed. I remember it like it was yesterday. The phone rang in the middle of the night, jolting me awake. Claire stirred beside me, groggily reaching for the bedside lamp, but I was already out of bed, my heart racing with a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. "Hello?" I answered, my voice shaking. It was the station. One of the officers, Wade, I think, sounded frantic, his voice barely coherent as he tried to explain what had happened. "There was a shooting," he said, his words rushed and panicked. "James, he didn't make it." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and everything around me faded into a blur of static and noise. "What?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Dan," Wade said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." I dropped the phone, my hands trembling as the weight of his words sank in. James, my friend, my neighbor, the heart of this community, was gone. The world felt like it had shattered, and I was left standing in the wreckage, unable to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. Rodrigo had made his move, and this time, James hadn't been able to stop him. The news spread quickly, and the neighborhood was plunged into a state of shock and mourning. People gathered in the streets, their faces pale with grief and disbelief. James had been a fixture in this community, a constant presence, a protector, and a friend. And now he was gone, taken from us in an act of senseless violence. In the days that followed, the details of what had happened slowly came to light. James had confronted Rodrigo and his associates, determined to put an end to their operations. But Rodrigo had been one step ahead. He had set a trap, luring James into a confrontation that ended in tragedy. The community was devastated. People came together to grieve, to share stories of the man who had given so much of himself to this neighborhood. There were tears, anger, and questions. So many questions that none of us had answers to. And through it all, one thought kept echoing in my mind. How could this happen to someone like James? How could the world be so cruel to a man who had only ever wanted to do good? It was a question that haunted me in the days and weeks that followed. And it was a question that would continue to haunt me for the rest of my life. When someone like James dies, it's like a light goes out in the world. A light that you didn't realize was guiding you until you're left fumbling in the dark. That's how it felt in those first few days after we lost him. The entire neighborhood seemed to be in mourning, a thick fog of grief hanging over us like a storm cloud that wouldn't break. Word of James's death spread quickly, and it didn't take long for the media to catch wind of the story. They called him a hero, a brave officer slain in the line of duty. They painted him as a martyr, a shining example of courage and sacrifice. But none of that did justice to the man he was. None of it captured the depth of his kindness, the strength of his convictions, or the way he genuinely cared about each and every one of us. To the world, he was Officer James, a fallen hero. But to us, he was just James, our friend, our neighbor, our protector. And the loss of him was more than just a headline or a soundbite. It was a wound that cut deep, one that wouldn't heal easily, if ever. The days following his death were a blur. I remember sitting in my living room, staring at the wall as Claire tried to hold everything together. She was a rock, taking care of the little things that needed doing while I struggled to process what had happened. I was numb, unable to grasp the reality of it all. It felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The funeral was held a few days later. It was a somber affair, with the entire neighborhood turning out to pay their respects. The church was packed, with people spilling out into the streets, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. It was a testament to just how much James had meant to this community, how deeply he had touched the lives of those around him. I remember standing there, staring at the casket, my heart feeling like it was being squeezed in a vice. The priest was speaking, but his words seemed distant, muffled by the weight of my emotions. All I could think about was how wrong it all felt, How unfair it was that someone like James, who had given so much of himself to this world, had been taken from us in such a senseless way. When the service ended, we made our way to the cemetery. It was a cold, overcast day, with a biting wind that seemed to cut right through you. The sky was heavy with clouds, threatening rain, and there was a sense of impending finality in the air. As we gathered around the grave, I couldn't help but feel like we were all on the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of something we couldn't quite comprehend. They gave James full honors, folded the flag, played the bagpipes, and fired the rifle salute. It was all so formal, so rehearsed, and yet there was a rawness to it that cut through the ceremony. It was a reminder that this wasn't just a ritual. It was a farewell to a man who had given everything he had to a world that hadn't always been kind to him. I stood there, watching as they lowered the casket into the ground, and I felt a wave of anger wash over me. Anger at the senselessness of it all. Anger at the injustice of losing someone like James. And anger at the world for taking him from us. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. As the ceremony came to an end, people began to file out, murmuring their condolences and offering quiet words of support, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the freshly turned earth, feeling like the world had lost something irreplaceable. Claire came up beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Come on, Dan," she said softly. "It's time to go." But I couldn't go. Not yet. I wasn't ready to say goodbye. "It shouldn't have happened," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "He didn't deserve this." "I know," Claire replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But he wouldn't want you to carry this alone." I knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier. James had been more than just a friend. He had been a constant in my life, a source of strength and guidance. And now he was gone, and I didn't know how to fill the void he had left behind. The days that followed were a haze of grief and confusion. People stopped by to offer their condolences, bringing food and flowers, but none of it made a difference. The loss of James was a wound that no amount of kindness could heal. It was a wound that cut deep, leaving a scar that would never truly fade. As the community tried to come to terms with the loss, there was an undercurrent of anger and resentment simmering just beneath the surface. People wanted answers, wanted someone to blame for what had happened, and as more details about the night of James's death came to light, that anger only grew. Rodrigo was the name on everyone's lips. It wasn't long before rumors started spreading. Whispers of how he had orchestrated the confrontation, how he had lured James into a trap, knowing that it would end in bloodshed. People talked about how Rodrigo had fled the scene, leaving James to bleed out in the cold, dark alley where he had fallen. The police launched an investigation, but it felt like too little, too late. James was gone, and no amount of justice or retribution could bring him back. The community was left grappling with the senselessness of it all, struggling to make sense of a world that seemed determined to punish those who tried to do good. For me, the loss of James was more than just the death of a friend. It was the death of a part of myself. He had been a light in my life, a reminder that goodness still existed in a world that often seemed devoid of it. And without him, the world felt darker, colder, and more uncertain. There were days when I would sit on my porch, staring out at the empty street, and half expect to see James walking up the driveway, that familiar grin on his face and a story on his lips. But he never came. And each time reality set in, it felt like losing him all over again. One evening, not long after the funeral, I found myself standing in front of James's house. The lights were off, the windows dark and empty. It felt like the house had lost its soul, the warmth and life that had once filled it, now replaced by a hollow, aching silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, the weight of my grief pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I thought about all the times James had been there for me, all the moments of laughter and friendship that we had shared, and I couldn't help but feel angry. Angry at the world, angry at Rodrigo, and angry at myself for not being able to protect him. It wasn't fair. James had given so much of himself to this community, to this world, and in the end it had taken everything from him. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to make sense of it. I didn't know how to reconcile the goodness of James with the cruelty of his fate. As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, I felt a presence beside me. I turned to see Tyler, the troubled kid that James had taken under his wing. He was standing there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "Hey, Tyler," I said softly, unsure of what else to say. "Hey," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us struggling to find the words to express the depth of our grief. Finally, Tyler spoke. "I didn't get to say goodbye," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't get to thank him." Tears welled up in my eyes and I felt a lump form in my throat. "Neither did I admitted, my voice thick with grief. Tyler looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "He was the only one who ever believed in me," he said, his voice breaking. "And now he's gone." I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some semblance of comfort. "He believed in you for a reason, Tyler," I said softly. "He saw something in you, something good, and that hasn't changed." Tyler didn't respond right away. He just stared at the ground, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Finally, he nodded, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "I'm gonna make him proud," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not gonna let him down." I felt a swell of emotion rise within me. Grief, pride, and hope all mingling together in a bittersweet symphony. James may have been gone, but his legacy lived on in the lives he had touched, the people he had believed in, and the goodness he had brought into this world. As Tyler and I stood there, staring at the darkened house that had once been filled with so much light, I realized that James's story wasn't over. His life may have been cut short, but the impact he had made, the lives he had changed, would endure long after he was gone. And in that moment, I knew that even though the world had lost a good man, his goodness would continue to ripple outward, touching the lives of those who had known him and those who would come to know him through the stories we told. James's death had been a tragedy, an unfair, senseless loss that none of us could ever fully comprehend. But his life had been a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are people who are willing to stand up, to fight for what is right, and to make the world a better place. And that, more than anything else, was the legacy of James, the good cop who had given everything he had for a world that didn't always deserve it. The days that followed James's funeral were a blur. Time felt different, stretched out in some moments, frozen in others. There was an emptiness in the air, a heavy silence that hung over the neighborhood, like a dark cloud that refused to lift. We all went through the motions, returning to work, picking up the kids from school, mowing the lawn. But there was an unspoken understanding that things would never be the same. I think, in some ways, we were all waiting for something, for some kind of closure, some kind of sign that it was okay to move on. But closure never came, not in the way we wanted it to. Instead, there was only the dull ache of loss and the lingering question of why. Why had this happened? Why had we lost someone so good, so kind, so irreplaceable? The investigation into James's death dragged on for weeks, with no clear answers and no real justice. Rodrigo had vanished, slipping into the shadows like a ghost, leaving behind only the devastation of what he had done. The police were working hard, or so they said, but each day that passed without an arrest felt like another wound, another reminder that the world didn't always operate the way it should. In the meantime, the community did what it could to honor James's memory. People set up a memorial for him at the park where he used to play basketball with the neighborhood kids. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes piled up around the bench where he'd sit and talk to them, offering advice, encouragement, and sometimes just a laugh. It became a gathering place, a quiet space where people could come to remember him and share their stories. I went there often, sitting on the bench late at night when the streets were empty and the air was still. Sometimes I'd close my eyes and imagine that he was still sitting there beside me, cracking a joke or sharing one of his ridiculous stories from the beat. But the truth was always there, just beneath the surface. James was gone, and nothing would ever bring him back. One evening, about a month after his death, the community decided to hold a vigil in his honor. It was something we all needed, a way to say goodbye, to come together and remember the man who had given so much to this place. People gathered in the park as the sun began to set, holding candles and wearing somber expressions. It wasn't a large event, just the people who knew him best, the ones who had been touched by his kindness and his dedication. As I stood there, looking around at the faces of my neighbors, I realized just how much of an impact James had made. There were people from all walks of life, kids, parents, elderly couples, young professionals, all united by their shared love and respect for the man we had lost. It was a testament to who James had been, the kind of person who could bring people together, even in death. The vigil was simple, quiet, and full of emotion. People took turns speaking, sharing their memories of James and how he had touched their lives. Some stories were funny, like the time he had rescued Mrs. Thompson's cat from a tree, even though the cat clearly wanted nothing to do with being rescued. Others were more serious, like the time he had talked down a teenager who was on the verge of making a life-altering mistake. When it was my turn to speak, I felt a lump form in my throat. I had known James better than most, but finding the right words to describe him felt impossible. How do you sum up the life of someone who had given so much, who had meant so much to so many? I don't think I can stand up here and tell you anything you don't already know, I began, my voice shaky. James was a good man, one of the best I've ever known. He wasn't just a cop, he was a friend, a mentor, and a protector. I paused, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on me, waiting for me to continue. I could stand here and tell you all the stories I've shared with James, the laughs, the late-night talks, the moments when he was there for me and my family. But I think what matters most is what he stood for. James believed in people. He believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it didn't make sense. He believed in helping others, not because it was his job, but because it was who he was. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. And the hardest part about losing someone like James is knowing that there aren't enough people like him in this world. He was one of the good ones, the kind of person who made you believe that there was still some good left in the world. As I spoke, I saw tears in the eyes of some of the people gathered around me. They weren't just mourning the loss of James, they were mourning the loss of what he represented. In a world that often felt chaotic and unjust, James had been a beacon of hope, a reminder that one person could make a difference. I think we all know that James didn't deserve what happened to him, I continued, my voice growing heavier with emotion. He didn't deserve to be taken from us like this, but I also know that James wouldn't want us to be consumed by anger or bitterness. He would want us to remember the good, to hold on to the light he brought into our lives, and to carry that forward. I looked down at the candle in my hand, the flame flickering gently in the evening breeze. James may be gone, but his light hasn't gone out. It lives on in each of us, in the way we treat each other, in the way we care for this community. That's the legacy he left behind, and it's up to us to keep that alive. When I finished speaking, there was a heavy silence in the air, a silence filled with grief, love, and a shared sense of loss. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I didn't wipe them away. James had been more than just a friend. He had been a guiding force in my life, and losing him had left a hole that I didn't know how to fill. After the vigil, people lingered in the park, talking quietly and sharing stories. It was one of those rare moments when the community felt united, bound together by the shared experience of loss and the desire to honor the man we had loved. The air was cool, the sky darkening as the last light of day faded, but there was a warmth in the gathering, a sense that we weren't alone in our grief. As I made my way back home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that James was still with us. Maybe not in the way we wanted, but in the way that mattered. His influence was everywhere, in the small acts of kindness we extended to one another, in the way we looked out for each other, and in the way we honored his memory by continuing the work he had started. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly began to heal. Life moved on, as it always does, but there was a subtle shift in the way people interacted. We were more careful with each other, more thoughtful, more aware of the impact we had on one another. It was as if James's spirit had left an indelible mark on this place, reminding us all of what it meant to truly care for one another. There were still moments when the grief felt overwhelming, when I'd pass by his house and feel a pang of sadness, or when I'd hear a joke and instinctively think to share it with him, only to remember that he was no longer there. But in those moments, I found comfort in the knowledge that James's legacy lived on. He had made a difference, not just in the lives he had saved, but in the way he had made us all better people. The investigation into Rodrigo continued, but the justice system moved slowly, and there were no quick answers. I didn't know if we'd ever get the closure we needed, but in the end, that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that James had lived a life worth remembering, a life that had touched so many others. And that was a legacy that no one could ever take away. James had once told me that being a cop wasn't just about catching the bad guys, it was about protecting the people you cared about making sure that the place you called home was safe for everyone. He had lived by those words, and even in death, he had shown us what it meant to be truly good. As I sat on my porch one evening, staring out at the quiet street, I thought about the man who had been my friend. I thought about the laughter, the late-night talks, and the moments of quiet strength that had defined our friendship. And I realized that while James may have been gone, his influence would never fade. He had been the heart of this community, the soul of this place. And even though we had lost him, we hadn't lost the lessons he had taught us, the lessons of kindness, compassion, and unwavering belief in the goodness of people. James had lived a life of service, of sacrifice, and of love. And in the end, that's what we would remember him for. He was more than just a good cop, he was a good man, and that's why we would never forget him.